Hey everyone, welcome to Hands on Books. I'm going to start this episode with a brief recommendation of Crucible of War by Fred Anderson. I just started reading this and I'm a little over 100 pages in and it's been great so far, about the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. And my exposure, and I'm sure this is not uncommon, to the French and Indian War is mainly through The Last of the Mohicans. But I just wanted to read the prologue or opening hook to this book because it's really vivid, and if it strikes a chord with you, you'd probably like the rest of it. But first, the back. In Fred Anderson's vivid and compelling narrative, the 7 Years' War takes on a new and profound significance. Far from being a mere backdrop to the American Revolution, the 7 Years' War eliminated French power north of the Caribbean, destroyed an American diplomatic system in which Native Americans had long played a balancing role, and hardened the attitudes of both the colonists and the British, forging the tensions that would lead to disintegration of the British Empire in North America. With panoramic sweep, Anderson reveals how a skirmish involving an inexperienced George Washington, the Iroquois chief Tamerlane, and the ill-fated French emissary Jumonville initiated a chain of events that would lead to world conflagration. The narrative weaves together the motives of all the participants, not the least of whom are the American colonists, men who had assumed they were partners in the empire, but who now encountered British officers who treated them as subordinates. Brilliantly illuminating the clash of cultures at the heart of the 7 Years' War, Anderson demonstrates how the forces unleashed would irrevocably change the politics of empire. Fred Anderson is Associate Professor of History at the University of Colorado, Boulder. He is the author of A People's Army, Massachusetts Soldiers and Society in the 7 Years' War, as well as articles, essays, and reviews. And this is from 2000. So skipping ahead to the prologue here, Jumonville's Glen, May 28, 1754. The rain had fallen all night, a steady, miserable rain, and when at last the light grew to the point that he could see his troops, George Washington realized that 7 of them were lost in the forest, God knew where. For hours he had blundered through the dripping dark, time and again leading the little column off the trail, sometimes taking a quarter hour just to grope his way back to the track. Confused, untrained, and wretched, the 40 soldiers who had somehow held together through the night were hardly prepared to fight any enemy, let alone one experienced in forest warfare. Nonetheless, the tall Virginian led them on, following the Indian warrior who had come to warn them of their peril. Toward daybreak the rain stopped, and the remnants of Washington's patrol reached the Indian camp. There the soldiers dried and loaded their muskets, while Washington conferred with the old chief who had summoned him. Tamerlane, called the Half-King by the English who regarded him as an ally, described the tracks he had seen nearby. They led toward a sheltered place he knew. There, he suspected, the French had bivouacked since the day before. Washington's soldiers could march to a spot nearby and wait while his own men reconnoitered. Once the warriors knew the enemy's strength and disposition, they and the Virginians could fall in the camp together. Washington agreed. He had no choice. However little he cared for Indians, however little he trusted them, he could never have found the Frenchmen's camp without them. Surely he could not have found it in time to dispose his men in firing positions while the French, groggy with sleep, were just starting to cook breakfast at the foot of a tall rock face. Quietly his men and the Indians stationed themselves above and around the narrow glen, while on its floor Frenchmen still crawled from their bark lean-tos and stretched themselves in the early light. As always in such affairs, no one knows exactly what happened next. Perhaps, as the French later said, the English fired on them without warning. Or perhaps, as Washington maintained, a Frenchman shouted a warning that sent his comrades flying to their arms and firing up into the woods. All that is certain is that the English fired 2 volleys down into the hollow, while the French returned a few ragged shots and tried to retreat into the shelter of the trees. But there was no escape. The Half-King's warriors had blocked the path, forcing the 30-odd Frenchmen back into the clearing, where English fire pinned them down. An officer called for quarter, and Washington ordered his men to cease firing. Perhaps 10 minutes had passed since the first shot. It had been a lopsided skirmish. Around the rim of the hollow, 3 of Washington's troops were wounded, and 1 lay dead. At its bottom, the French had suffered 14 casualties. One of the wounded, a 35-year-old ensign named Joseph Coulon de Villiers de Jumonville, identified himself as the detachment's commander. Through a translator, he tried to make it known that he had come in peace, as an emissary with a message summoning the English to withdraw from the possessions of His Most Christian Majesty, Louis XV. The letter he carried would make everything clear. His interpreter would read it. As the combatants' adrenaline levels subsided and the wounded men moaned, the translation went badly. The letter had to be read a second time, and Washington turned to take it back to his own translator. As he withdrew, Tenagresin stepped up to where Jumonville lay. He said, "Thou art not yet dead, my father." He raised his hatchet and sank it in the ensign's head, striking until he had shattered the cranium. Then he reached into the skull, pulled out a handful of viscous tissue, and washed his hands in Jumonville's brain. The tall Virginian, who until that instant had thought himself in command, did nothing while the half-king's warriors, as if on signal, set about killing the wounded. Within moments, only one of the Frenchmen who had been hit in the firefight was left alive. Recovering his composure, Washington now salvaged what he could by forming his men around the 21 surviving prisoners and hustling them to safety. Behind them, in the bloody hollow, the half-king's men scalped and stripped the 13 corpses, decapitating one and impaling its head on a stake. Then they, too, abandoned the glen, and crows flapped noisily down from the trees to begin the feast. Soon wolves would lope in to do their part. Eventually maggots and beetles and ants would finish the job in meticulous silence. By afternoon, Washington was back at his own camp, groping for explanations and trying to plan his next move. Since boyhood, he had dreamed of battle's glory. Now he had seen combat, but no heroism. Only chaos and the slaughter of defenseless men. Why had it happened? What could he tell his superiors? What could happen next? George Washington had none of the answers. There could hardly be a clearer example of a historical moment when events vastly incommensurate with human intention begin to follow from the efforts of an individual to cope with a situation run out of control than this otherwise ordinary Wednesday morning in May 1754. Nothing could have been further from Washington's mind, or more alien to the designs of the men who had entrusted him with troops and ordered him to the Ohio Valley, than beginning a war. Neither he nor his masters imagined that they were setting in train events that would destroy the American Empire of France. Much less could they have foreseen that a stunning Anglo-American victory would lead to yet another war, one that would destroy Britain's empire and raise in its ruin the American Republic that Washington himself would lead. So extraordinary indeed were the events that followed from this callow officer's act and hesitations that we must begin by shaking off the impression that some awesome destiny shaped occurrences in the Ohio Valley during the 1750s. For in fact, the presence of French troops and forts in the region, the determination of Virginia's colonial governor to remove them, and the decisions of the French and British governments to use military force to back up the maneuverings of colonists deep in the American interior all resulted from the unusually powerful coincidence of some very ordinary human factors. Ambition and avarice, fear and misunderstanding, miscalculation and mischance. How such a combination could produce a backwoods massacre is not, perhaps, hard to imagine. How that particular butchery gave rise to the greatest war of the 18th century, however, is less easy to explain. To understand it, we must first chart the paths by which the interests of the Iroquois Confederacy, the government of New France, the governor of Virginia, and a group of Anglo-American land speculators all converged in the spring of 1754 at the spot where the Allegheny joins the Monongahela, and the Ohio's waters begin their long descent through the heart of America to the Mississippi and the sea. I just loved that opening. If that's something that you like, check out Crucible of War by Fred Anderson. And now let's open some books. So this is The Lions of Al-Rassan by Guy Gavriel Kay. And I've always seen Kay recommended as a great writer, and I've always wanted to check him out. Over the centuries, the once stern rulers of Al-Rassan have been seduced by sensuous pleasures. Now King Al-Malik of Kartada is on the ascendancy, adding city after city to his realm, aided by his friend and advisor, the notorious Amr ibn Khayran, poet, diplomat, soldier, until a summer day of savage brutality changes their relationship forever. Meanwhile, in the north, the Jadites' most celebrated and feared military leader, Rodrigo Belmonte, and Amr meet. Sharing the interwoven fate of both men is Jahan, the beautiful, accomplished court physician whose own skills play an increasing role as Al-Rassan is swept to the brink of holy war and beyond. In a magnificent setting, hauntingly evocative of medieval Spain, The Lions of Al-Rassan is both a brilliant adventure and a deeply moving story of love, divided loyalties, and what happens to men and women when hardening beliefs begin to remake or destroy a world. Kind of a beat-up paperback, but it was pretty cheap, so no worries. This is from 1995. The evening is deep inside me forever. Many a blonde northern moonrise, like a muted reflection, will softly remind me and remind me again and again. It will be my bride, my alter ego, an incentive to find myself. I myself am the moonrise of the South. Paul Klee, The Tunisian Diaries. It was just past midday, not long before the third summons to prayer, that Amr ibn Khayran passed through the Gate of the Bells and entered the palace of Al-Fantina in Selvines to kill the last of the caliphs of Al-Rassan. Passing into the Court of Lions, he came to the 3 sets of double doors and paused before those that led to the gardens. There were eunuchs guarding the doors. He knew them by name. They had been dealt with. One of them nodded slightly to him. The other kept his gaze averted. He preferred the second man. They opened the heavy doors and he went through. He heard them swing closed behind him. In the heat of the day, the gardens were deserted. All those still left within the dissolving magnificence of the Al-Fantina would have sought the shade of the innermost rooms. They would be sipping cool sweet wines or using the elaborately long spoons designed by Ziriani to taste sherbets kept frozen in the deep cellars by snow brought down from the mountains. Luxuries from another age, meant for very different men and women from those who dwelt here now. Thinking such thoughts, Ibn Khayran walked noiselessly through the Garden of Oranges and, passing through the Horseshoe Arch, into the Almond Garden, and then, beneath another arch, into the Cypress Garden with its one tall, perfect tree reflected in 3 pools. Each garden was smaller than the one before, each heartbreaking in its loveliness. The Al-Fantina, a poet once had said, had been built to break the heart. At the end of the long progression he came to the Garden of Desire, smallest and most jewel-like of all, and there, sitting quietly and alone on the broad rim of the fountain, clad in white, was Muzaffar, as had been prearranged. Ibn Khayran bowed in the archway, a habit deeply ingrained. The old blind man could not see his obeisance. After a moment he moved forward, stepping deliberately on the pathway that led to the fountain. "Amr," Muzaffar said, hearing the sound. "They told me you would be here. Is it you? Have you come to lead me away from here? Is it you, Amr?" There were many things that could be said. "It is," said Ibn Khayran, walking up. He drew his dagger from its sheath. The old man's head lifted suddenly at that, as if he knew the sound. "I have indeed come to set you free of this place of ghosts and echoes." With the words, he slid the blade smoothly to the hilt in the old man's heart. Muzaffar made no sound. It had been swift and sure. He could tell the Wajis in their temples, if it ever came to such a thing, that he had made it an easy end. He laid the body down on the fountain rim, ordering the limbs within the white robe to allow the dead man as much dignity as could be. He cleaned his blade in the fountain, watching the waters swirl briefly red. In the teachings of his people, for hundreds and hundreds of years, going back and away to the deserts of the East where the faith of the Asherites had begun, it was a crime without possibility of assuaging to slay one of the God's anointed caliphs. He looked down at Muzaffar, at the round, wrinkled face, sadly irresolute even in death. "He has not been truly anointed," Al-Malik said, back in Kartada. "All men know this." There had been 4 puppet caliphs this year alone, one other here in Silvines before Musafar, one in Tudeska, and the poor child in Salos. It was not a situation that could have been allowed to continue. The other three were already dead. Musafar was only the last. Only the last. There had been lions once in Al-Rassan, lions upon the dais in this palace that had been built to make men fall to their knees upon marble and alabaster before the dazzling evidence of a glory beyond their grasp. Musafar had, indeed, never been properly anointed, just as Al-Malik of Kartada had said. But the thought came to Amar ibn Khairan as he stood in his 20th year in the Garden of Desire of the Alfontina of Silvines, cleansing his blade of a man's red blood, that whatever else he did with his life, in the days and nights Ashar and the gods saw fit to grant him under the holy circling of their stars, he might ever be known as the man who slew the last caliph of Al-Rassan. You are best with the god among the stars. It will be a time of wolves now, he said to the dead man on the fountain rim, before drying and sheathing his blade and walking back through the 4 perfect, empty gardens to the doors where the bribed eunuchs waited to let him out. On the way he heard one foolish bird singing in the fierce white light of midday, and then he heard the bells begin, summoning all good men to holy prayer. I love that so far. I think we'll leave that there and keep going. See what else we got. The Rise and Rule of Tamerlane by Beatrice Forbes Manz. This is the first scholarly study of Tamerlane, the great nomad conqueror who rose to power in 1370 on the ruins of the Mongol Empire and led his armies on campaigns of unexampled scope, ranging from Moscow to Delhi. As the last such ruler to unite the settled and steppe regions of Eurasia, his career marks the transition from the era of nomad conquest and rule to that of the modern ascendancy of the settled world. Professor Manz examines Tamerlane both as a supremely talented individual whose career changed the world in which he lived, and as an example of a nomad dynastic founder. Through his career, the author explores questions of general historical and anthropological interest, state formation, tribal politics, and the relations of tribes to central leadership. Beatrice Manz also analyzes Tamerlane's methods of control over both nomad and settled, and the relations between the two groups. Finally, 2 major appendices list and describe the tribes in Tamerlane's following and the offices within his administration. The Rise and Rule of Tamerlane is a major study of a key figure in the history of Central Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, and incorporates a great deal of new material. It will be essential reading for all students and specialists in these disciplines. This is from 1989. Let's read some of the intro. Tamerlane moved like a whirlwind through Eurasia and left a name familiar throughout the world. The record of his campaigns is long and vivid. From 1382 to 1405, his great armies crisscrossed Eurasia from Delhi to Moscow, from the Tian Shan Mountains of Central Asia to the Taurus Mountains in Anatolia, conquering and reconquering, razing some cities, sparing others. His activity was relentless and unending. Throughout his life, he kept his armies on the move, sometimes together, sometimes divided and dispersed throughout the countryside, but almost never at rest or at home. His fame spread quickly to Europe, where he remained for centuries a figure of romance and horror. While for those more intimately involved in his career, his memory still remains green, whether as the destroyer of Middle Eastern cities or as the last great representative of nomad power. Tamerlane is more correctly called by his Turkic name, Timur. The Western version of his name comes from the Persian Timur-i-Lang, Timur the Lame. He was born in Transoxiana, near Samarkand, probably in the 1320s or 1330s. Transoxiana had been part of the Chagatai Khanate, the region of Chinggis Khan's second son, Chagatai, and the Barlas tribe to which Timur belonged was descended from the Mongol Barulas tribe of Chinggis Khan's confederation. The Barlas and the other tribes of Transoxiana had remained nomadic but lived in close contact with the settled population, and through the adoption of Islam had come to participate in its culture. Timur's career belongs to the history both of the Middle East and of the steppe, and marks an important watershed in each. On the one hand, Timur represents the culmination of an old tradition. He is the last of the great nomad conquerors. He rose to power within a nomad confederation, and the members of this confederation formed the backbone of his army throughout his career. However, Timur's conquests were in one crucial sense different from those of Genghis Khan and most other earlier nomad conquerors. The world he conquered was not an alien one, but a known entity, almost all of which had been previously ruled by Mongols. Timur, moreover, aspired to rule not over the steppe, but over the Somme. He made no effort to secure his gains in Zungaria or the territory of the Golden Horde, but in his Middle Eastern territories, Iran, Khwarezm, Afghanistan, he established governorships and permanent garrisons. Other great steppe conquerors had also arisen in the borderlands between steppe and town, but most consolidated their hold first over the steppe. Timur, on the other hand, overran the steppe, but never aspired to rule it. Within the Middle East, Timur's conquests in the Eastern Islamic world coincided approximately with the Ottoman conquest of its western regions, and represent a similar phenomenon. These were Turkic conquests from within, by tribal groups who were able to manipulate both steppe and Islamic traditions and institutions. They could constitute themselves as a separate ruling stratum over the subject population, but they had sufficient knowledge of local traditions to rule directly and to participate from the start in Islamic culture. It is from this time that the Turkic people and the traditions of the steppe became truly indigenous to the Middle East. Despite the extent of Timur's conquests, the realm which he left to his successors was neither enormous nor secure. His death brought a bitter succession struggle among his sons and grandsons, which emptied the royal treasury and reduced the extent of the Timurid realm. Yet the ambiguities of his legacy did not dim the glory of Timur's achievement. What the Timurid dynasty lacked in power it made up for in cultural prestige, and its rulers actively cultivated the charisma of their ancestor as an integral part of their own legitimacy. Timur's successors ruled within the Islamic tradition, but continued to glorify their Turco-Mongolian culture, using its titles, its political institutions, and its emphasis on dynastic charisma for their own purposes. In this mixed culture of Islamic and Turco-Mongolian origins, the figure of Timur retained a central place, along with that of Genghis Khan. Timur now became a legendary figure, equipped with an elaborate and partly supernatural genealogy. Timur's myth proved highly useful to the Turkic dynasties which followed the Timurids in the Middle East and Central Asia, and it continued to flourish in the Eastern Islamic world into the 19th century. Timur's conquest marked the completion of the period of nomad conquest in the Middle East. While the Seljuk and Mongol sultans had ruled as outsiders, Timur's successors ruled as indigenous leaders, and under their rule the mixed Turco-Mongolian culture from which they sprang became entrenched in the Islamic world as part of a mature cultural complex. The great empires of the early modern era, the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals, owed much of their success to this new synthesis. Yeah, it's always fascinating to learn about these Central Asian steppe warriors. This seems like a cool source for that. Anyway, I'll keep moving, although that one seems fun. Mordew by Alex Pheby. I don't love the fact that it's ex-library, but... God is dead, his corpse hidden in the catacombs beneath Mordew. In the slums of the sea-battered city, the young Nathan Treves lives with his parents, eking out a meager existence by picking treasures from the living mud and the half-formed, short-lived creatures it spawns, until one day his desperate mother sells him to the mysterious master of Mordew. The master derives his magical power from feeding on the corpse of God, but Nathan, despite his fear and lowly station, has his own strength, and it is greater than the master has ever known. Great enough to destroy everything the master has built, if only Nathan can discover how to use it. So it is that the master begins to scheme against him, and Nathan must fight his way through the betrayals, secrets, and vendettas of the city where God was murdered and darkness reigns. Propulsive, compulsively readable, full of unforgettable characters and a talking dog who wants to be a philosopher, Mordew is an epic fantasy, strange, new, and terrifyingly alive. Let's give it a shot. Interesting map here. At first I thought this was all meant to be underground, but no, this will be ocean or sea with mountains here. Cool. I'll skip that. Anaximander as a character, interesting. Part 1. The Flint. The southern slums of the great city of Mordew shook to the concussion of waves and firebirds crashing against the seawall. Daylight, dim and gray through the thick clouds, barely illuminated what passed for streets. But the flickering burst of each bird flashed against the overcast like red lightning. Perhaps today the master's barrier would fail, drowning them all. Perhaps today the mistress would win. Out of the shadows a womb-born boy, Nathan Treves, trudged through the heavy mist. His father's old boots were too big, and his thick woolen knee socks were sodden. Every step rubbed his blisters, so he slid his feet close to the ground, furrowed them like plows through the living mud. He made his way along what slum dwellers called the promenade, a pockmarked scar which snaked from the sea wall to the strand. It weaved between hobbles lashed together from brine-swollen driftwood decorated with firebird feathers. Behind him he left his parents and all their troubles. Though his errand was as urgent as ever, he went slowly. A dying father, riddled with lungworms, is pressing business, and medicine doesn't come cheap. But Nathan was just a boy. No boy runs towards fear eagerly. In his fists, Nathan twisted his pillowcase. His knuckles shone through the dirt. He was walking to the circus, that depression in the earth where the dead life grew larger. Here, if fortune allowed, flukes could be found, choking in the mud. The journey would take him an hour, though, at least, and there was no guarantee of anything. All around, the detritus that insulated one home from another creaked and trembled at the vibrations of the wall and the movement of vermin. Though Nathan was no baby, his imagination sometimes got the better of him, so he kept to the middle of the promenade. Here he was out of the reach of the grasping claws and the strange, vague figures that watched from the darkness, though the middle was where the writhing mud was deepest. It slicked over the toes of his boots, and occasionally dead-life sprats were stranded on them, flicking and curling. These he kicked away, even if it did hurt his blisters. No matter how hungry he would never eat dead life. Dead life was poison. From nearby came the tolling of a handbell. It rang slowly and high, announcing the arrival of the fetches cart. From the shacks and hovels grown-ups emerged eagerly, doors drawn aside to reveal their families crowded within. Nathan was an only child, but he was a rarity in the slums. It wasn't unusual for a boy to have 10, even 15 brothers and sisters. The fecundity of the slum dwellers was enhanced by the living mud, it was said. Moreover, womb-born children were matched in number by those of more mysterious provenance, who might be found in the dawn light, mewling in a corner, unexpected and unwelcome. When overextended mothers and fathers heard the fetches bell, they came running out, boy children in their arms, struggling, and paid the cartman to take them to the master, where they might find work. So were these burdens, almost by alchemy, turned into regular coin, which the fetch also delivered for a cut. Nathan watched as coins were given, children taken, coins taken, children returned. Then he turned his back on it all and went on. The further he walked from his home, the less the drumbeat of the seawall troubled his ears. There was something in the sheer volume of that noise up close which lessened the other senses and bowed the posture. But when Nathan came gradually onto the strand, where it intersected the promenade and led towards the circus, he was a little straighter than he had been, a little taller, and much more alert. There were other slum dwellers here, too, so there was more to be alert to, both good and bad. Up ahead there was a bonfire, 10 feet high. Nathan stopped to warm himself. A man, scarred and stooped, splashed rendered fat at the flames, feeding them, keeping the endless rainwater from putting the wood out. On the pyre was an effigy of the mistress, crouched obscenely over the top, her legs licked with fire, her arms directing unseen firebirds. Her face was an ugly scowl painted on a perished iron bucket, her eyes 2 rust holes. Nathan picked up a stone and threw it. It arced high and came down, clattering the mistress, tipping her head over. People came to the Strand to sell what bits of stuff they had to others who had the wherewithal to pay. The sellers raised themselves out of the mud on old boxes and sat with their wares arranged neatly in front of them on squares of cloth. If he'd had the money, Nathan could have got string and nets and catapults and oddments of flat glass and sticks of meat, don't ask of what. Today there was a glut of liquor, sold off cheap in wooden cups, from barrels marked with the red merchant crest. There was no way this had come by legally. The merchants kept a firm grip on their stock and didn't sell into the slums, so it was either stolen or salvaged. Drinkers wouldn't know either way until it was drunk. If it was stolen, then buyers got nothing worse than a headache the next day, but if it was salvaged, then that was because it was bad and had been thrown overboard to be washed up port side. Bad liquor made you blind. Nathan wouldn't have bought it anyway. He didn't like the taste, and he had no coins and nothing much to barter with except his pillowcase and the handkerchief in his pocket. So he joined the other marching children, eyes to the floor, watching out for movement in the living mud. He didn't recognize anyone, but he wasn't looking. It was best to keep your distance and mind your own business. What if one of them took notice and snatched whatever was in your bag on the way home? There were some coming back, bags wriggling. Other bags were still, but heavy. A few had nothing but tears in their eyes, too cowardly, probably, to venture deep enough into the mud. Nathan could have stolen from those who had made a catch, grabbed what they had and run, but he wasn't like that. He didn't need to be. As he got closer, the itch pricked at his fingertips. He knew the itch, when and where it was likely to be used, and it wasn't far now. "Don't spark, not ever," his father used to stand over him when Nathan was very small, serious as he wagged his finger, and Nathan was a good boy, but even good boys do wrong now and again, don't they? Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between good and bad, anyway, between right and wrong. His father needed medicine, and the itch wanted to be used. Above, a stray firebird struggled up into the clouds, weighed down by a man hanging limp below it. I love that. Fun dump into the world, no explanation, figure it out. I like that sort of storytelling. All right, that's going to do it for this episode. Just a little recap. Guy Gavriel Kay, The Lions of Al-Rassan. This was $8, all from Abe Books. The Rise and Rule of Tamerlane by Beatrice Forbes Manz was $7. And Mordew by Alex Pheby was $9. And the only one I'm super happy with the quality would be this one, because it's this nice Cambridge University Press book with no writing for $7 on a topic that I've wanted to read more about. But these two not in great condition, especially because with these library books you can't ever really, or I've never found a good way to remove this sort of tape. It really just tears up the book completely. But oh well. Oh, and if you like history, definitely recommend Crucible of War, Fred Anderson, on the French and Indian War. Until next time, happy reading.